There are things that towns keep hidden, not beneath the earth, but in attics, in drawers, in the back offices of courthouses, where nobody ever thinks to look twice. A letter sealed away is one of those things. It rests in silence. It waits, and sometimes it waits so long that the people who once feared it are already gone, already beyond consequence, or at least that's what they believed. In Harlow, Virginia, there exists a letter written in the autumn of 1845 and sealed with black wax by a man who told no one what lay inside. He said only, and this was recorded exactly, word for word, in the minutes of the town council, that the letter was not to be opened until every person who had ever lived in Harlow during his lifetime had breathed their final breath. He warned that opening it before that day would bring nothing but sorrow. And the town, being proud and practical, laughed at him. It took 91 years. In 1936, when the last surviving resident from that time finally passed away, a woman aged 94 who had been born the same year the letter was sealed, the town clerk found the envelope in a cedar box in the basement of the old municipal hall, exactly where the records said it had been placed. The wax was still unbroken. The ink on the outside, written in that man's distinct handwriting, had barely faded. The letter was opened on a Thursday afternoon in March in front of 7 witnesses. By Friday evening, 2 of those witnesses had resigned from public office. By the following Monday, the oldest families in town had stopped speaking to one another. And by the end of that summer, Harlow had lost something it would never fully regain. Not its buildings, not its land, but its story. The story it had always told about itself. What was in that letter? That is exactly what we are about to discover. And I promise you, by the time we finish, you will understand why the man who wrote it chose to seal it rather than speak it aloud. You will understand why the town kept it buried for 91 years. And you will find yourself wondering, as many have, whether it would have been better for everyone if it had remained sealed forever. Before we go further into the story of Harlow, Virginia, and the letter that unraveled it, make sure you are subscribed to Canal English Loft so you never miss a story like this one. And leave a comment below. Tell us what state or city you are listening from. We want to know where in the world our listeners are tuning in. Now let us return to the beginning, because to understand the letter, you first have to understand the man who wrote it. His name was Edmund Farrow. He was born in 1798 in a small farmhouse on the eastern edge of what would later become Harlow, in a stretch of Virginia Piedmont where the soil ran red and the creeks stayed cold even in summer. His father, Thomas Farrow, was a tobacco farmer of moderate means, not wealthy enough to be invited to the grand houses along the river, but not poor enough to be overlooked at market. He owned 12 acres, 2 horses, and a reputation for honesty that his neighbors valued and his competitors resented. His mother, Clara, was the daughter of a Welsh immigrant who had arrived in the 1760s and settled in Virginia with the stubborn belief that the New World owed him a living. Edmund was the second of 4 children, and by all accounts that survive, he was the peculiar one. Not peculiar in any obvious way, not wild, not violent, not prone to outbursts or visions. Peculiar in the quieter, more unsettling sense. He noticed things. He noticed things that others walked past without ever seeing, and he had a habit, which his mother tried and failed to break, of writing them down. As a boy, he kept a small notebook in his coat pocket, and whenever something caught his attention, he would stop mid-step and record it. A discrepancy in a neighbor's fence line, a horse that had changed owners without anyone mentioning it, a widow who suddenly had money for repairs she couldn't afford for years. Thomas Farrow died in 1819 when Edmund was 21, leaving him the farm and a modest debt. Edmund paid off the debt in 3 years, not by selling more tobacco, but by lending money at interest to his neighbors, carefully, with terms fair enough to be accepted and precise enough to be enforced. By 1825, he was the most reliable lender in the county. By 1830, he was on the town council. And by 1835, when Harlow was formally incorporated as a town, Edmund Farrow was the one who drafted the charter. He was not the mayor. He never ran for mayor. In fact, he seemed to go out of his way to hold positions that carried authority without visibility. Town clerk, then town treasurer, then chairman of a small committee whose official purpose was to oversee the maintenance of public roads, but whose real function, as anyone paying attention understood, was to manage the tangled web of debts, favors, and obligations that held Harlow together. He knew where every dollar in town had come from and where it had gone. He knew who owed whom and who had forgiven what. He knew, in the precise and unsentimental way of a man who has spent his entire life observing, which families had risen and which had quietly fallen, and which had simply arranged to appear as though neither had happened. People found him useful. They found him useful in the way people find a certain tool useful, reaching for it when needed, setting it aside when not, and never quite stopping to wonder what it feels like to be the tool. Edmund Farrow, as far as anyone could tell, did not seem to mind. He never married. He lived alone in the house he'd inherited, kept it clean and orderly, and seemed to require very little from the world beyond the ability to observe it. There was one person in Harlow who seemed to truly know him. Her name was Ruth Patton, and she was the wife of a dry goods merchant named George Patton, a loud, generous, and somewhat careless man who was universally liked and perpetually in financial difficulty. Ruth was quieter than her husband and sharper. She and Edmund had grown up within a mile of each other, had attended the same church as children, and had maintained for 30 years a friendship that the town noted without fully understanding. It was not romantic. Everyone agreed on that, or at least everyone said so. But they were close in a way that suggested they shared something neither had ever shared with anyone else. Ruth Patton died in October of 1843 from a fever that swept through Harlow that autumn, taking 11 people with it. She was 44 years old. Edmund Farrow was at her bedside when she passed. He did not attend the burial service. He returned home and for the first time in anyone's memory, he did not show up at the weekly council meeting. He sent word that he was unwell. He stayed away for 3 weeks. When he returned, he looked the same as always. Same dark coat, same careful eyes, same habit of arriving exactly on time and leaving exactly when business was finished. But something inside him had shifted. Those who knew him well, and there were not many, sensed that the thing that had kept him engaged with Harlow's daily affairs was Ruth Patton, and that with her gone, his engagement had become something different, something more deliberate, more final. Over the next 2 years, 1844 and 1845, he spent most of his time in quiet, methodical activity that no one understood at the time. He began reviewing old records. Not current records, not the ledgers and road reports that were part of his official duties, but older ones, the founding documents of Harlow, the land grants, the deeds of sale going back to the 1790s, the records of the old county court that had jurisdiction over this area before the town was incorporated. He requested documents from the county seat. He wrote letters, many of them, though he kept copies of none that anyone could later find. On at least 3 occasions, he was seen walking the boundaries of various farms on the edge of town, measuring distances, comparing them to maps he carried folded in his coat. When people asked what he was doing, he said he was conducting an audit of the town's property records. It was a plausible answer. He had done similar things before. As treasurer. Nobody pressed him. In September of 1845, Edmund Farrow came to a council meeting and announced, without much ceremony, that he intended to write a letter. He said the letter would contain an account of certain matters he had uncovered during his research, and that he believed the council should be aware of its existence. He said the letter would be sealed and deposited with the town's official records, and that it was not to be opened until every person then living in Harlow had died. The council, to put it plainly, found this absurd. Councilman Frederick Haynes, whose family had been in Harlow since before the town had a name, said that Farrow had clearly spent too much time alone since Mrs. Patton's passing, and perhaps he should consider taking a holiday. There was polite laughter. Another councilman, Arthur Dunning, who had made his money in timber, said he had no intention of approving any document he wasn't allowed to read. Edmund Farrow said quietly that he wasn't asking anyone to approve anything. He was simply informing the council, as a matter of courtesy, that the letter would exist. He handed the council a written statement describing the letter's existence, its location, and the conditions for opening it. He asked them to enter it into the minutes. They did so reluctantly, with the general sense that they were humoring a man who had grown eccentric in his grief. The letter was placed in a cedar box. The box was locked, and the key was given to the town clerk with instructions that it was to pass from clerk to clerk until the time came. Edmund Farrow himself kept no copy. He never spoke of the letter's contents to anyone. Not in any recorded conversation, and not apparently in any conversation that was ever remembered. He died in April of 1848, 3 years after sealing the letter. He was 50 years old. The doctor recorded the cause of death as heart failure. He left no will. His property, the house, the 12 acres, and a small amount of money, was divided among distant cousins he had never mentioned. The town attended his funeral in reasonable numbers, said appropriate things about his service, and returned to its business. The cedar box remained in the basement of the municipal hall. And Harlow went on living the story it had always told about itself. To understand what was in the letter, you have to understand what Harlow was. And to understand what Harlow was, you have to understand what it was built on. The Piedmont region of Virginia in the late 18th century was not the elegant, orderly society that later generations would romanticize. It was raw and opportunistic, carved from a landscape that did not give itself up easily. The men who settled it were not all the upright pioneers of popular memory. Some of them were, but some were men who had come west from the Tidewater region because the Tidewater had become too settled, too watched, too governed. The Piedmont was a place where things could be arranged quietly without too many questions. Land in Virginia at that time was distributed through a system of grants and patents that was, on paper, carefully administered. In practice, it was a chaos of overlapping claims, fraudulent surveys, forged signatures, and outright theft dressed in legal language. The county courts were staffed by the same men who were filing the land claims. The surveyors were often hired by the very people whose land they were measuring, and the records, where they existed at all, were maintained with a casualness that made them nearly useless as a check on dishonesty. The Haynes family, Frederick Haynes's ancestors, had arrived in the region in 1791 with a land patent for 400 acres. By 1810, they owned 2,000. The expansion was documented in a series of deeds and purchases that appeared entirely legitimate on their face. Each transaction had the required signatures, the required witnesses, the required notations. The land had passed from hand to hand in an orderly fashion, except that some of the people who had supposedly sold their land to the Haynes family did not appear anywhere else in the historical record after the date of the sale. They did not move to other parts of the county. They did not appear in the records of neighboring counties. They did not die in the county. Their deaths were not recorded. They simply vanished. Their names existed in a single document, the deed of sale, and nowhere else. The Dunning family followed a similar pattern. Arthur Dunning's grandfather had arrived with a modest timber claim in 1803. By 1825, he controlled most of the timber-producing land in the northern part of what became Harlow. Some of that expansion was documented by purchases that mirrored the Haynes acquisitions. Transactions with sellers who then disappeared from all records. And there was a third family, the Corrells, who had made their money less in land than in the labor that worked it. The Correll family had been among the earliest users of enslaved labor in the region, and their records, which Edmund Farrow had studied in particular detail, contained a series of transactions that, when placed alongside county court records and local church registers, told a story darker and more precise than anyone in Harlow in 1845 had publicly acknowledged. This was not broadly unusual for Virginia in that period. The brutal economics of the era produced exactly these kinds of records. But the specific details Edmund Farrow had uncovered were not broadly about the era. They were specifically about Harlow, about the families who had founded it, governed it, named its streets, filled its council seats, and sat in the front pews of its church. About the precise mechanisms by which certain families had risen and others had disappeared. About documents that had been altered, records selectively preserved, and at least 3 specific events involving specific people in specific places at specific times, that the official record of Harlow had quietly erased. What those events were, we will get to. But first, let's talk about what Edmund Farrow actually found. Because the letter did not simply make accusations, it made them with evidence. And the evidence was what made it devastating. Edmund Farrow was not by temperament or training a lawyer. He had no formal education beyond what was available in the county in the early 1800s, reading, writing, arithmetic, some Latin, some scripture. What he had instead was something rarer, the habit of comparison. He had spent 30 years handling the town's financial records, and in that time, he had developed an almost involuntary tendency to cross-reference. When a number appeared in one ledger, he automatically checked it against related ledgers. When a name appeared in one document, he looked for it in others. He did not think of this as investigation. He thought of it as housekeeping, keeping the record straight, ensuring the accounts balanced. The problem was that in Harlow, the accounts did not balance. He had noticed this years before Ruth Patton's death. Small discrepancies. Things that might have been clerical errors, might have been simple omissions, might have been nothing. He had noted them in his private papers and set them aside. After Ruth died, he found himself returning to those notes. Perhaps it was a way of staying occupied. Perhaps it was something else. The sense that he owed it to her, that she had known things she had never fully said, that he had been too careful for too long. What he found, when he began to look in earnest, was a series of land transactions in the 1790s and early 1800s that could not be reconciled with any other part of the record. Specifically, there were 11 deeds of sale in the county records, documents by which various individuals had purportedly sold their land to the Haynes and Dunning families, that referenced witnesses who, when Pharaoh checked the church registers and the tax records and the road maintenance logs, had no other documented existence in the county. They were names that appeared on a single document and nowhere else. Not before, not after. This alone might have been explained in various ways. Record-keeping was inconsistent. People moved. People were missed. But Pharaoh did not stop there. He obtained, through a contact at the county courthouse, the original survey plat for several of the disputed tracts. Survey plats in Virginia at this time were required to include the name of the surveyor and the names of any chainmen, the assistants who held the measuring chain. Pharaoh compared the surveyors named on the disputed plats with the list of licensed surveyors recorded at the county level. 3 of the surveyors named on the disputed plats did not appear on the county's list of licensed surveyors. One of the plats bore a surveyor's name that could be matched to a real person. But that person had died 14 months before the survey was supposedly conducted. The implication was not subtle. The surveys were false. The deeds of sale that relied on those surveys were therefore suspect. And the land they described, land that was now the foundation of the Haynes and Dunning family holdings, land that had been in those families for 40 years, land the town's entire sense of itself was built upon, had been acquired through fraud. But the land fraud, as bad as it was not the worst of what Pharaoh had found. The worst had to do with 3 specific people. 3 people whose names appeared in a set of documents that Pharaoh had uncovered in a very particular place. Not in the county courthouse, not in the town's official records, but in a private ledger that had belonged to a man named Harold Carell, the patriarch of the Carell family, and that had passed at his death in 1839 into the possession of his son William Carell, who had apparently not thought to destroy it, and who had left it, along with other business papers, in a locked trunk in the storage room of a building he owned, and occasionally rented to the town for civic functions. Pharaoh had access to that building in his capacity as town clerk. He had handled the rental paperwork, and when, in the course of sorting through the building's contents to prepare for a new tenant in the summer of 1844, he had come across the trunk, he had opened it. The trunk was not sealed. The lock was old and had long since lost its key, and the hasp could be lifted with a thumbnail. Pharaoh had opened it, found the ledger, and read it. What he read in that ledger, specific names, specific dates, specific transactions, and certain notations partly in private shorthand, but decipherable with patience, constituted, as far as Pharaoh could determine, a record of 3 deaths. Not recorded deaths, not acknowledged deaths, the kind that do not appear in any church register or court record, because they were never meant to. The 3 people were a man named Samuel Oakes, who had owned a tract of 30 acres on the western edge of what became Harlow, a woman named Margaret Voss, who had been employed in the Carell household, and a man whose full name Pharaoh was never able to determine, referred to in Harold Carell's ledger only by a first name, James, and by a notation that suggested he had for a time been attempting to bring a claim against the Carell family in the county court. Samuel Oakes's land now belonged to the Haynes family. It had been transferred via a deed of sale dated February 1802, a deed with no witnesses whose names could be found elsewhere. Samuel Oakes himself had no recorded history after January 1802. Margaret Voss had worked in the Carrel house from approximately 1800 to 1803. She appeared in the household account records for that period. Payments recorded, duties described. After 1803, she was gone, not dismissed, not departed, not recorded anywhere. Harold Carrel's ledger contained an entry for the summer of 1803 that Pharaoh had decoded after considerable effort, matter of MV, resolved at the Gilead property. No further correspondence. The Gilead property was a tract of undeveloped woodland about 3 miles east of what became the town centre. By 1845, it was owned by the Carrel family themselves. James, only James, had apparently, sometime around 1807 or 1808, been preparing to file suit against Harold Carrel over the terms of a labor contract. There was a letter in the trunk, unsigned and unaddressed, that described the situation in terms making clear the writer believed the suit would be damaging. 2 ledger entries followed, dated 4 months apart. The second read, J. Matter closed. No proceedings anticipated. Pharaoh did not know for certain what had happened to these 3 people. He had no bodies. He had no witnesses. He had a ledger written in the private shorthand of a man who had been dead for 6 years and a series of absences, conspicuous documented absences that were consistent with one reading of events and not easily explained by any other. What the letter contained, as he wrote it in the autumn of 1845, was not a formal accusation. It was a presentation of the evidence he had gathered, organized as carefully as any financial audit, and addressed. He wrote this explicitly on the sealed envelope, to whoever in Harlow's future was prepared to face what its past had actually been. He wrote the letter in 3 sittings. It took him the better part of a week. He sealed it with black wax on a Thursday evening in October, carried it to the municipal hall on Friday morning, placed it in the cedar box, and handed the box to the town clerk with the instructions already on record. Then he walked home. He made himself a cup of tea. He sat by his window and looked out at Harlow, at the road he had helped pave, the church he had helped fund, the council hall whose charter he had written. And whatever he felt in that moment, he kept entirely to himself, as he had kept everything else. Now before we go any further, if this story is making you think, drop a like and let us know your theory in the comments. What do you believe Edmund Pharaoh truly discovered? And was he right to seal that letter rather than speak? Keep listening, because what we have uncovered so far is only the foundation. What comes next is where the story truly begins to unravel. The years passed. Harlow grew as small Virginia towns grew in the middle decades of the 19th century, unevenly, with bursts of energy followed by long stretches of quiet. The railroad came through the county in 1851, cutting 6 miles south of town in a decision that benefited the larger market town of Culper and left Harlow slightly to the side of things. The tobacco economy softened. Several of the older families diversified into other enterprises, grain milling, small-scale manufacturing, the kind of commercial activity that suited a town no longer able to rely on a single crop. The Civil War, when it came, passed through Harlow without the direct catastrophe that struck other parts of Virginia. Though it took its tithe in young men and left the economy in a condition requiring years to recover. The founding families endured. The Haynes remained prominent, their land reduced from the peak years but still substantial, their presence in the town's civic life continuous, their name on the deed of the oldest church and the largest parcel of what had once been common ground. The Dunnings had mostly moved away by the 1870s, though a branch of the family returned in the 1890s and re-established itself with modest success in the hardware trade. The Carrels had declined sharply after the war, their labor-based wealth stripped away, their patriarch's generation aging out, their younger members scattered. By 1900, the Carrel name in Harlow was largely a historical echo, mentioned in connection with an old house now privately owned and a small plot of land that had been deeded to the town for use as a park. Through all of this, the cedar box sat in the basement of the municipal hall. Clerks came and went. 2 of them apparently had no clear memory of the box's significance. They knew it was in their custody, knew it had instructions attached, but had either not read them carefully or not taken them seriously. One clerk, Charles Brent, who served from 1879 to 1893, had apparently opened the box and examined the exterior of the sealed envelope, made a note that it existed, and replaced it without opening the letter itself. His note, found in the same file as the original 1845 council minutes, said, "Cedar box containing sealed document per Pharaoh instructions. Condition intact. No grounds for opening at present." Brent had clearly read the instructions. He had honored them. He had simply not thought to explain them to anyone afterward. By 1910, the municipal hall had been renovated. The basement had been cleared and reorganized. The cedar box had been moved to the County Records Annex, a newer building a block away, where it was catalogued among a collection of historical municipal documents. The catalogue entry read, "Box, Duma 47, Harlow Town Records, Misk, late 1800s. There was no specific mention of a sealed letter or its conditions. Whoever had transferred the box had either missed or forgotten the instruction document, which had apparently been kept loose inside the box rather than firmly attached to it. This was how, for the next 2 decades, the letter nearly escaped notice altogether. It sat in box number 47 among tax records from the 1880s and road survey reports from the 1870s, in a building consulted primarily by lawyers researching property titles and the occasional genealogist. At least 3 people handled the box during this period without ever realizing the sealed envelope inside was anything other than a piece of uncatalogued correspondence. 2 of them set it aside. One, a young clerk named Percy Howell, who worked at the annex in the early 1920s, actually tried to open it out of curiosity before noticing the wax seal and deciding it looked too official to tamper with. He mentioned it afterward to his supervisor, who made a note to investigate its origin. The investigation was never completed. Percy Howell left the annex for a position in Charlottesville. His supervisor was transferred. The note sat in a file. But in 1931, a new town archivist named Dorothy Stokes was appointed. She was by all accounts an extraordinary woman for her time, 40 years old, the widow of a schoolteacher, possessed of a methodical and slightly obsessive commitment to the accuracy of historical records. She had no formal training in archival science. She had learned it herself through practice and through correspondence with the State Library in Richmond. She took the annex and its collection more seriously than anyone had in years. Dorothy Stokes found box 47 in the summer of her first year. She found the sealed envelope inside it. She found, tucked behind a loose board in the back of the box that no one had apparently noticed, the original instruction document from the 1845 council meeting, the written statement in Edmund Pharaoh's own hand describing the conditions of the letter's opening. She read it twice. Then she sat down. Then she read it again. The condition was specific. The letter was not to be opened until every person who had lived in Harlow during the lifetime of the letter's author had died. The letter had been written in 1845. Pharaoh had been born in 1798. The question then was whether anyone still living had been alive in Harlow at some point before 1845. Dorothy Stokes did the arithmetic and realized with a slight chill that it was entirely possible that someone still qualified. A person born in Harlow in, say, 1844, would have been alive during Pharaoh's lifetime and would now be, in 1931, approximately 87 years old. Not impossible, unlikely, but not impossible. She began to look. What followed was 5 years of painstaking research, not conducted continuously, but woven into her regular archival work, in which Dorothy Stokes attempted to establish whether any person meeting the specified condition was still living. She consulted church birth and death records going back to the 1790s. She wrote to the families of long-established Harlow residents. She reviewed census records. She was, in essence, doing exactly what Edmund Pharaoh had done 60 years earlier, cross-referencing, comparing, building a careful picture from disparate sources. She found 2 people who might qualify. One was a man named Elias Granger, who had been born in Harlow in 1841 and was thus 4 years old when the letter was sealed. By 1931, he was 90. She tracked him to a nursing home in Fredericksburg. He died there in December 1932. The second was a woman named Louisa Haynes. Louisa Haynes was the last surviving member of the Haynes family. She had been born in Harlow in 1842, 3 years before the letter was sealed, which meant that she had technically lived in Harlow during Pharaoh's lifetime. By 1931, she was 89 years old. She still lived in Harlow, in the old Haynes house on Maple Street, attended by a nurse and by her great-niece, a woman named Clara Haynes, who had married into the family and was the last Haynes in residence. Dorothy Stokes found her, interviewed her gently about family history, about memories of the old town. Louisa Haynes, despite her age, was sharp. She remembered the Pharaoh name. She said her father had spoken of him, not with fondness, but not with hostility either. A careful man, she said, too careful for his own peace of mind. Dorothy Stokes did not tell Louisa Haynes about the letter. She simply waited. Louisa Haynes died on the 14th of February, 1936, at the age of 93. She was the last survivor. Dorothy Stokes notified the town clerk 3 days later. She brought him Pharaoh's original instruction document. She brought him box number 47 with the sealed envelope inside. She set them both on his desk and said, "I believe it is time." The clerk, a man named Walter Gibbs, 52 years old, a practical and unimaginative man who had held the position for 11 years, looked at the envelope, looked at the instruction document, and looked at Dorothy Stokes. He asked her if she was certain about the chain of documentation, whether she was confident this was what it purported to be. She said she had spent 5 years verifying it. She was certain. Walter Gibbs scheduled the opening for Thursday, March 12, 1936. He invited 6 witnesses, the mayor of Harlow, George Tatum, the county circuit court judge, 2 members of the town council, the editor of the Harlow Courier, a local newspaper, and Dorothy Stokes herself. He arranged for the event to take place in the council chamber of the Municipal Hall, the same building where Edmund Pharaoh had once served, though the building itself had been replaced by a newer structure in 1904. On the afternoon of March 12, 1936, 91 years and 5 months after Edmund Pharaoh had sealed the wax, Walter Gibbs broke it open. The room was plain and functional, a rectangular space with oak paneling that had darkened over the decades, 2 long windows facing the street, and a table in the center that had seen 30 years of budget discussions and zoning disputes. There were 8 chairs around the table. 7 were occupied. On the table in the center was the envelope. Walter Gibbs had prepared a formal statement acknowledging the chain of custody and the conditions of opening. He read it aloud. It took 4 minutes. The judge confirmed the documentation was in order. The editor of the Courier, Francis Dyer, who had been covering local news for 20 years and had never covered anything that felt like this, had a notepad in front of him and was writing before the envelope was even opened. The envelope was made of heavy paper, the kind used for official correspondence in the 1840s. Thicker than modern envelopes, slightly rough to the touch, slightly yellowed along the edges, but otherwise remarkably preserved by the cedar box and the dry basement. The black wax seal had held. Gibbs broke it with a letter opener. The seal cracked cleanly, the way old wax does when it has never been disturbed. A sound witnesses later reported was oddly loud in the quiet room. One councilman, Howard Pierce, later told his wife that the sound of that wax cracking was something he would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. Inside the envelope were 7 folded sheets of paper covered on both sides in Edmund Pharaoh's small, precise handwriting. The ink had faded from black to a dark brown, but it was legible. Perfectly, maddeningly legible. Walter Gibbs read it aloud. It took 38 minutes. The room, by the account of 3 of the 7 witnesses, was absolutely silent for the first 10 minutes. Then the mayor made a sound, not a word, just a sound, low and involuntary. And after that, no one spoke again until Gibbs finished reading. What Pharaoh had written was this. He began with the land surveys, the false ones, the names of surveyors who did not exist, the witnesses on deeds who could not be found in any other record. He was careful to acknowledge that he could not, from the records available to him, establish absolute certainty. Some of the absences might have innocent explanations, but he laid out the pattern, 11 transactions, all within a 15-year window, all involving the same 2 families, all showing the same characteristic irregularities. He named specific parcels. He cited specific document numbers in the county record. He named specific dates. He was precise in a way that made it clear he had spent years on this, that he had checked and rechecked, that he was not writing from anger or grief, but from the same meticulous accounting practice that had made him the town's most reliable treasurer. Then he moved to the Corel ledger. He described how he had found it. He described what it contained. He acknowledged directly and without softening that he could not prove murder, that the word he was using was disappearance, and that the records he had found were consistent with death by foul means, but not conclusive. He named Samuel Oakes. He named Margaret Voss. He named James, with the notation that he had never been able to determine a surname. He described the ledger entries and what they appeared to mean. And then the part that silenced the room most completely, he wrote about what he believed connected the land fraud and the disappearances. Margaret Voss, he wrote, had been employed in the Corel household at the same time that several of the disputed land transactions were being finalized. She had been, he believed, a witness. Not a legal witness, not someone named on a document, but a human witness, someone who had been in the room or nearby when things were arranged that were not meant to be witnessed. The entry in Harold Corel's ledger referring to her as a matter resolved at the Gilead property came 3 months after the last of the disputed land transactions in that cluster. Whatever she had seen or known, she had apparently at some point indicated that she was aware of it. Samuel Oakes had resisted selling his 30 acres. There were entries in a county court record, a record Pharaoh had found in a box of unfiled papers at the courthouse, apparently misfiled decades ago, indicating that Oakes had appeared before a magistrate in late 1801 to dispute a survey of his land that he claimed was inaccurate. The magistrate's response was recorded as claim reviewed and found without merit. The magistrate who reviewed it was Daniel Haynes, Frederick Haynes's grandfather. James, whoever he was, had tried to pursue a legal remedy for a wrong done to him by the Corel family and had, by Pharaoh's accounting, been prevented from doing so in a manner suggesting the prevention was permanent. Pharaoh did not use inflammatory language. He did not write with passion or rage. He wrote the way he had always worked, methodically, economically, without embellishment. The facts he presented were the argument. He made no explicit call for any particular action. He wrote that he had sealed the letter rather than spoken its contents because he had concluded, after long consideration, that speaking it in his own lifetime would accomplish nothing except to destroy him without helping anyone the destruction was meant to help. The families he named were powerful. The evidence he held, though substantial, was circumstantial. The people who had suffered were gone, and no legal remedy was possible. But the record, he wrote, should not be allowed to remain false. Harlow should not be allowed to continue believing and telling its children that its founding families had built their place in the world through honest work and fair dealing. Someone in the future ought to know the truth, even if the future could do no more with it than the past could. He ended the letter with a single sentence that several witnesses apparently could not read without their voice changing. I have lived in this town my whole life. I have kept its accounts and drawn its boundaries and signed its documents. I have done my best to leave the record straight. This letter is the last thing in the record that was not. Walter Gibbs set down the 7 pages. He looked at the room. He said nothing. For a long moment, neither did anyone else. It was the judge who spoke first. He asked to see the pages. Gibbs passed them to him. The judge read through them, not aloud, just to himself, slowly. And when he was done, he set them down and put his hands flat on the table and said, in a voice that Francis Dyer would quote exactly in the Courier the following morning, Lord Almighty. He knew. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Harlow, Virginia, only deepens. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries from American history. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Because what happens next, what this letter does to the living, is something no one in Harlow saw coming. Francis Dyer published his account of the opening the following morning, Friday, March 13, 1936, on the front page of the Harlow Courier. He did not publish the full text of the letter. He had, at the request of the judge and the mayor, agreed to hold back the specific names of the Corel, Haynes, and Dunning families until the legal questions could be assessed. What he published was a careful factual account of the opening itself, the date, the location, the chain of custody, the approximate content, and the single quotation from the judge. He described the letter as containing allegations of historical fraud and possible criminal